Good morning, everybody, and thanks to the conference organizers for giving me this opportunity to share some insights. I hope you'll find them useful into a topic that is quite dear to my heart and that I've done a lot of work over the last 3 to 4 decades on sexual harassment in South African workplaces. So I've titled my talk, Sexual Harassment, Something to Think About, and I will take you through why I've said that, something to think about, because I hope it will give you something to think upon going forward and helping you to understand this very difficult topic. Okay, so just a quick overview. We're going to do introduction, then we're going to have a look at some themes, and then we're going to look at 6 dynamics that I found very important to understand. And then finally, I'm going to describe a conundrum, and that's largely to do with the inquisitorial versus the adversarial approach to these cases. And then finally, we're going to stop on what I've called the very, very sensitive issue, and we'll come to that at the end. So just to start on the 6 dynamics. First of all, I want to just make a point before we start on these, that we're not going to touch on law. My approach to this, the contribution that I can make, comes from a mental health background. And therefore, I was really surprised and delighted when my conference paper was given the opportunity to be heard at this venue, because we are not talking about law, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Employment Equity Act, the different codes of good practice with regard to sexual harassment, but I'm going to try and offer you another perspective. So before we go on, let me just ask you in your mind's eye to imagine the metaphor of an iceberg. So of course, an iceberg consists of the little bit of the top that you can see above the water, but we all know that there is often a lot happening beneath the water. So above the water, in sexual harassment cases would be the company policy, the other HR policies, and all the employment law that has a focus on sexual harassment, as I said, the Constitution and so on. But we are going to focus on what lies beneath, some of the dynamics underneath the iceberg. And those are really important. And why I chose the title of Sexual Harassment, Something to Think About, is I think that the input I give you will pose more questions than provide answers. And that's really what I wanted to do, just open up a new perspective. For some of you, my perspective might be what you know pretty well already, and for others, it might indicate a different approach. And there are 4 themes that I would like to highlight for you, and we'll come back to them. You'll see they're endemic in dealing with sexual harassment at the workplace. And these are that the cases and processes involved can be extremely complex. They can also be extremely emotive. People have strong views about what's happened or what hasn't happened. Sexual harassment case can be very divisive in a workplace, and we'll look a little bit more at that, and then also pretty disruptive. Okay, so going on to the 6 dynamics, and I must apologize at this stage for a couple of them. I really am going to have to read some notes because I've had to put careful preparation into how I describe some of the concepts that I will be sharing with you today. So the first is the issue of intent versus impact. And we know that in a lot of cases, impact, or the subjective landing on a person as what has happened, has been highlighted as more important than the intention of the person, of the alleged perpetrator. And some people are pretty comfortable with that. Other people are less comfortable with the subjective nature. as we all know, that somebody can burst into a room and there could be 6 people sitting there, something is said, and there might be 6 totally different responses, ranging from indifference to feeling really hurt or harassed in some way by what somebody has said, feeling it's inappropriate. And we know that the concept of some sort of objective test is gaining more ground. But as it stands at the moment, a lot of attention is given to the impact on the alleged victim. But we know that in many cases, and I've certainly dealt with a lot of these, sometimes what is said is so gross that anybody listening to it would be offended by it. And I'm thinking of many cases that I've done in terms of the quid pro quo sort of sexual harassment, where people have openly said to another person, if you come to my home and spend the night with me, or if I see you regularly, you will get that promotion. I can guarantee you'll get a salary increase, and so on. So that is one form of sexual harassment where, you know, the intent is very clear. Whereas in other cases, people would say, but I just didn't mean to say and offend the person, but they have. So that can be quite a tricky issue to navigate. The second issue, which or dynamic that I want to bring to your attention, is a pretty well-known one in all cases of harassment or other sexual abuse cases, such as rape. And we know that due to a range of factors, many victims feel simply unable to speak out what's happened to them. And then people get uncomfortable that it's been 3 or 4 years since this has happened and the person's only come forward now. I think you need an investigation into that, that's kind of case specific. But what happens, and I've heard many victims talk about this, is when something is actually said or there's been a behavior, people are often so upset and they go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. And when people have described this often, when something is said or there's a behavior, maybe a groping or a touch or a suggestion, something like that, the first thing that the person will do, the victim, will ask themselves, did it happen? Is it possible that this person could have said this thing to me? Did I hear correctly? So seeds of doubt are cast, and that can be very fearful for people to deal with, or very difficult for people to deal with. Okay, so the clever trick, not to say that that's mentioned in a pejorative way, the clever trick of many harassers of all types, not only sexual, is that a dynamic that they set up is that their victims are somehow made to feel as if they are culpable or have been complicit, or indeed it was something that they did. Maybe in one case the woman said, perhaps I smiled too much over lunch, and sort of gave off the wrong impression. And this really can be very harmful. Also, there's just huge amount of fears around what will people say about me? Will I be blamed or judged in some way? We know, and we've seen often, people who are being cross-questioned as the victim during rape cases, and in the end, the other party has to say, this person's morality or behavior is not on trial here. And we find a similar thing, but people really do fear being blamed or judged. And there are lots of concomitant fears as well. There's a fear that if I speak up, I will make waves, I'll be seen as a troublemaker, I'll be victimized in some way. A fear, especially if the harasser, which is often the case, that they have some positional power, they are more senior with more power in the organization than the person they choose to approach in this way. And also people have asked themselves, what about the reputational risk to the organization? And we know of cases in the last few years in South Africa where there have been very, very high level of damage done through reputational risk in terms of sexual harassment cases that have gone public. But I must just tell you that the most shocking example I had of this, even I was surprised with years and years of doing very difficult workplace mediations, disputes, investigations, is there was a company, it has plants all over South Africa, and 3 of their senior female members of staff who were on EXCO were harassed badly over a long period of time, just absolute serial harassment by these 3 people who sat on EXCO with them and made their lives a misery. And it's only when somebody confessed and opened up in a confidential way to somebody at head office was this ever known. And then to the astonishment, it was people there were 3 people in the same functional team, but in different areas. And that really brought it home to me, how silencing the victim is such a theme. Okay, another dynamic, as we know, as in race cases, not race cases, as in rape cases, sex is secondary to power. At the end of the day, it's not so much about the sexual behavior as such, it's about the need to dominate. And in many cases that I've done, as well as obvious sexual harassment, along with it comes bullying, insulting, belittling, telling people that they aren't good enough. And the people that this happens to are not powerless people with no agency. Astonishing, they're often very successful career people. Okay. The next thing I want to just bring up as a dynamic is confidentiality. We know that in sensitive cases at the workplace, the policy will say that there must be confidentiality. But in actual real life, this is often not achieved, and this can set up a whole set of tricky dynamics that make dealing with the case more difficult. So the principle of confidentiality is there to protect and safeguard the alleged victim as well as the alleged perpetrator. But in the real world, the alleged victim may have already shared with other co-workers what they're going through. We always know that there is a rumblings, there is the grapevine, there are rumors, and then very often what happens is one or both of the parties will try and garner support or lobby support for their version of the story. Okay, and then I wanted to just mention the serial harasser as a particular category. I've done one huge case involving this difficult circumstances, but here it is said that these are the most difficult cases to deal with because the harasser carefully builds up an image so that people find the allegations hard to believe. And another thing that this type of harasser will do is strike in private so that they set up a he said, she said scenario. And the man that I was involved with, the allegations against him, he was an excellent manager. He was deeply religious, happily married, and very supportive of the team, and used to give them a lot of support. He would know when their mothers were ill or their sisters were struggling. He really was seen as a very supportive person. So these allegations took a lot of people by surprise. And then the last that I want to talk about in terms of the 6 dynamics is dealing with the fallout. And this is an end step of a process once a case has been dealt with or even happens during a case. And what I wanted to say here is that I have said that this is divisive and disruptive, the nature of the sexual harassment, and it often stays within an organization long after, or at least during or immediately following the case. The fact is that many people indirectly and directly related to the case, such as the alleged victim, colleagues, bystanders, family members of both parties, people involved in the disciplinary process, who gave evidence for, who gave evidence against, so who took sides. And the wider group needs to be dealt with in an individual or team debriefing process, so that people can discuss how they're feeling and also deal with a lot of misunderstanding. And wrongful, not understanding the outcome and why that was the outcome. And if you don't do this, dealing with the fallout, I have had many cases where the effects of the case can be the cause of many interpersonal conflicts and a general low morale for a long time across a workforce. And last year or the year before, I dealt with an organization where 3 years after the perpetrator had been dismissed and had left the organization, there was still a lot of conflict and divisive behavior. People were in different camps. Okay, now I want to come on to the issue of a conundrum. I want to talk about the victim-centered approach versus the legal principle that is very dear, I know, in terms of innocence until proved guilty. So I'm just going to read from some notes that I made here. What is a victim-centered approach? This is the systemic focus on the needs and concerns of the victim to ensure compassionate and sensitive dealing with the matter in a non-judgmental way. This, of course, covers many forms of abuse, such as rape. We know that when people go to police stations, they are disbelieved. What they went through might be trivialized. There would be long waits at hospitals, no counseling or support offered. I know that many organizations have made an effort in this regard, but people can feel very, very bewildered and alone and just make the decision not to carry on with the case. In the workplace for sexual harassment cases, this means identifying and training people in sexual harassment who can support the alleged victims through their ordeal. The organization needs to create an atmosphere that will encourage people to lay complaints in a way that in doing so they don't feel as if they face a hostile environment at work, but find support and guidance. And a lot of victims will tell you that they did indeed have a very hostile, judgmental environment at the workplace. And of course, innocent until proven guilty may mean that there are many weeks where the alleged victim feeling unheard, scared, unsupported, especially where alleged perpetrators are senior or powerful people in the organization. And then I posed the question, is there a contradiction here? And how can one marry the principles of both those approaches? And then just quickly taking you through some notes on adversarial, inquisitorial versus adversarial. In sexual harassment cases, especially with serial harassers, there are very different opposing and competing versions of what happened. This can be very difficult to deal with unless there are credible witnesses or bystanders who are able to corroborate one version. It is often the he said, she said, or single witness scenario, when it, of course, is the one person's word against the other. Many people advocate that in such cases, the inquisitorial approach, as opposed to the adversarial one, is better. Here, an expert in the subject matter undertakes a thorough investigation and makes a finding based on the outcome of this investigation. Such an intervention has many of the needed ingredients to handle sensitive and disruptive cases, which include that it's not in the wider public interest to make people fear reprisals and so on, and lead to companies sweeping sexual harassment cases under the carpet or doing a very confidential separation agreement with the person. Secondly, this kind of investigation allows a thorough interrogation into a complex matter which is not fettered by the rules of evidence and the rigors of cross-examination, which may have negative outcomes for both the victim and the perpetrator. Thus, an inquisitorial approach. In this approach, it can be ensured that any evidence given by the alleged victim will be made available to the alleged perpetrator, who can then put forward questions for the investigator to pursue with either the complainant or the witness or the perpetrator. And bear in mind, as I've said before, that both parties may be drumming up support for their versions, and this also plays a role in dividing people into camps. And then the very, very sensitive issue that I would like to raise finally and leave you with is the allegation of false harassments. Okay, I just want to say that these are not common in workplace sexual harassment. In fact, in the more than 30 years I've been doing this work, I've come across 2 cases. What made me think about saying something about this, which I would have in any case, but I listened to a talk show on 702 where we're talking about sexual harassment. And quite a few people phoned in to say either they had been falsely accused, and a mother phoned in to say that her adult son had been falsely accused. And they spoke about what a nightmare this can be, and it certainly can be. But there were very, very strong opinions given by listeners who phoned in to say we should not even be entertaining this issue, because if you even entertain it, you might be seen to be trivializing the issue, and people might then have a propensity to say, oh, I'm sure that's false, just like we've heard many cases are. So we really, really have to be careful here. False allegations do happen. If you have a good investigator who knows the subject, they will be easily able to see the truth from an allegation. And I just wanted to say that the 2 cases that I had were really quite extraordinary. One was when I was a commissioner at the CCMA just after its opening. I was there for a number of 1,000 disputes over a few years. And I had this gobsmacking case of a couple who came in, the woman and her husband came into the conciliation with the employer, who they both accused of sexual harassment. And I don't have the time to go into the details. They didn't settle the matter. The employer party assured me in a side caucus that he was not guilty of this. And when it came back for arbitration, we had another commissioner with a mental health background go and do the arbitration. And I don't know what happened, but that couple openly admitted that they did this for a living. We were very shocked and surprised, because something like that we'd never heard of before. And then in the second case, and I was very involved in the investigation, is that in fact, the alleged victim herself was guilty of sexual harassment. And in the middle, she decided to leave the organization. In the middle of the disciplinary hearing, I should say, she decided just to resign and never ever took the matter further. Okay, so in closing, I just want to revisit these 4 themes and leave them with you. And my guidance to people is, when you are facing a sexual harassment case, please get somebody in who is expert to guide you. We know there are lawyers who are experts, there's psychologists, labor relations people, mediators. Make sure the person has a good amount of experience in the field and is able to deal with very difficult, complex, emotive, divisive, and disruptive processes. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure to share some thoughts with you, and I hope you find them useful.